Good morning. Welcome. We're at the end of 17 weeks reflecting on grown-up perspective on Christianity. I hope it's been helpful for you. Today's gathering is just to look back and also to think about how this series has impacted us. Let's begin just by taking a moment of centering and focusing on breath, body, heartbeat, presence. Breathing in and out. In and out. Welcoming this day, welcoming this moment. Saying yes to our physical presence, our emotional presence, our intellectual presence, the presence of neighbors, the presence of the holy. Yes. 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 All right, I'm going to go right to PowerPoint I prepared to sort of summarize all 16 previous weeks. All right, so cast your mind back to 2021, October. That's when we started, and I began with what I call the parable of the old book. Think about an old book that has meant something to you in your life. Childhood, youth, young adulthood, or 10, 20 years ago. Some book that you just really had an affection for, that taught you something. By the way, the pads are for later today, but if you want to take any notes as we go along, that's fine too. So think about that old book, and you haven't really taken it down off the shelf in a while. But as you're looking at your books, you say, oh yeah, that meant something to me once. You pull it down off the shelf and you start to peruse it or even read it cover to cover. And you say, oh, that's why I liked that book. Or I had trouble with that part of that book at that time. What does it mean to me today? Or I never did understand this, but now I do kind of understand it. Or I did understand it before, and now I don't think I understand it that much. The whole purpose of these last 16 weeks is sort of to think about Christianity as that old book, because we've all had lots of previous experiences with Christianity in one way or another, even if only in popular culture. Because some of our participants here did not grow up Christian. But Christianity is like that. It has things that have appealed to us, things that have repelled us. But to take a fresh look at it can help us look through current experiences and understandings at something we have struggled with or received or enjoyed in the past. And Christianity can then still have life or life again for those maybe who have found it hard to have an adult relationship with Christianity that's fruitful for you. That's what we were trying to do in 17 weeks. The inspiration for the title, Meeting Christianity Again for the First Time, is from our dearly departed friend, Marcus Borg, who wrote all those books about Bible, God, Jesus, Christian faith. I heard him in a video say that his vocation, as he understood it later in his life, was to help adults come to terms positively with Christianity. With adult minds, adult perspectives, adult experiences, the experiences provided in one's life. That was his vocation. And I think that's a good vocation for spiritual enrichment at WCC. So that's what we've been doing these 16 weeks. The first 3 weeks, I tortured you with lots of writing. Those of you who participated in those 3 weeks will remember lots of questions where I was asking you to reflect in writing about what you learned about Christianity growing up, what you didn't learn, what your feelings were about your Christian formation, what was lacking, what was emphasized, what never made sense, what made sense then but doesn't make sense today. And that if you were to look at Christianity fresh as an adult, what questions would you have today? What topics would you like covered in this series? What were some of your favorable impressions of Christianity? What are some of your more troubled impressions of Christianity? Do you remember all that? Those of you who were here? Yeah. And I compiled all that. And after compiling the responses themselves, I started counting keywords. I don't know if this is a scientific means saying what's important to you, but I counted keywords. And these were the keywords. Now, the way I counted them, of course, is kind of subjective. And the way I bunched them was very subjective. This is an art, not a science. But this is how I counted the keywords, and this is how I collated them. All of this was to help me kind of decide November going forward what we would talk about. Do you think we've hit most of these?
Yes.
Yes.
There's one we did not, at least one in mind, and that's this one, the afterlife, etc. We just did not get there. Well, there's always next year, as they say in Wrigleyville.
We have to.
Do we have to? No, we don't have to. I perceived in here a really strong interest in the sense of social ethics. What's it good for? How are we to live it to make the world a better place? And actually, in the next 7 weeks from now, not by design, a little bit more like by accident, that's really where we'll be focused in a very keen way. I also asked in that survey, what's one positive or neutral aspect of Christianity that you'd really like included in this series? And I bunched together 12 responses around these themes of compassion, acceptance, peace, kindness, etc. And then likewise, I bunched 11 responses around negative or difficult aspects of Christianity. We did not really do much on evil and suffering, what theologians call theodicy. And that's one of our topics we did not really address in these 16 weeks. The classic question, why do bad things happen to good people? And if God is good, why is there suffering and evil? And then whether we can answer those or not, how are Christians to respond in light of the reality of suffering and evil? We did kind of touch on that, but not the why question so much. So I took from all of that as a governing vision for myself as organizer, that the remaining weeks would be kind of a tour of the major themes and resources of Christianity, especially how they guide and inspire us to make the world a better place, otherwise known as social ethics. And by major themes and resources, I mean everything that makes up Christianity, the panoply, the wide variety of metaphors, images, narratives, concepts, practices, history, symbols. So out of the last conversation in that sort of preliminary period came a conversation about Jesus as indigenous. I don't know if you recall that. I don't even remember. I think it was a morning devotion that got us thinking about this way that Jesus can be reimagined and is reimagined, culture after culture, era after era, in a way that makes Jesus real and relevant for that culture and that era. And Jesus as indigenous really turns the tables on colonial style Christianity, which is essentially what Western Christianity has been about, using the gospel to subdue and Europeanize other peoples. To imagine Jesus as a sub-Saharan African or an indigenous person or Asian is to put the Christian project of we're better than you, listen to us, do what we tell you. We're here to help you. It puts that whole Christian project in question. So that just kind of happened. That wasn't a plan. Yes,
I
Bosie?
make a comment. I'm suddenly remembering a magnificent, huge painting of Jesus and the disciples in the castle in Uppsala, Sweden. They were all blonde,
Yeah.
Yeah.
pale blonde. Nobody was a brunette.
Right.
Wow.
Out of that conversation, this was just organic conversation, as I recall. We mentioned that one of the principal 20th century images of Jesus is as liberator. But this isn't just 20th century. I mean, go back to before Jesus and the story of the Exodus. We have a God who, through Moses, is liberating the people from slavery in Egypt, from oppression, right? This isn't as new or as radical as you might think. And then we talked about the social gospel. Lois, you've been a great resource in these 16 weeks. Thank you. Your experience at Union Seminary, where you actually were there at the center of
The social gospel. Yeah, I was wanting to mention this term.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, if I can take a moment, this has been a very interesting week regarding a neighbor who the other night waiting in the lunch line, he helped me with a humidity problem and etc. So we were acquainted. And I said, "Are you enjoying the Olympics?" And by the way, he and his wife had been missionaries in the UA, one of the Gulf Arabic.
Yeah,
UAE,
yeah,
what is it?
Emirates,
Yes, been missionaries there. You would assume that having missionaries in this Muslim-oriented country and other places too, they would be having a social appreciation of other cultures. No, he's not. He sort of became a person I hadn't recognized from my extremely friendly neighbor. We don't know him in fire. I'm not watching the Olympics. Chinese are bad. They shouldn't have the Olympics there. And he didn't say Chinese leaders. He said Chinese people are bad. And I thought to myself, you're a Christian missionary, huh? At this point, there were people surrounding, and I was in the midst of this, oh my gosh, thinking, tiptoeing around this, I got into, I'm not going to back down, but I mentioned, well, leadership can be difficult. I said, I'm old enough. I'm older than. It's so handy to be 95 in these discussions. And
as articulate as you are.
well, at time, I grew up extremely shy. I had to practice this. When my back gets up, I speak up.
You did well. You did.
Very Swedish, you know.
Okay, we do need to move on.
Anyhow, the point being, I brought up that, and here I tiptoed. I said, I won't remember Hitler and how he takes over the defenseless Germans in any case, swiftly through. And with Trump, this I really, he didn't blink. I said, and I'm watching Trump acting the same way as 100 years before Hitler did, moving into a situation that needed leadership of some sort. And Putin, KGB, I said, these aren't bad people. These are leaders who take advantage of situations in which they could climb over people, or words to that effect. Anyhow, then we went to dinner.
After our conversation about social gospel, I mentioned that Reinhold Niebuhr really inherited that tradition of social ethics in a way that expanded social gospel. Social gospel was always kind of viewed as a little naive, that if we're just lovey-dovey with people, that the world will be fine. And then along came World War I, the Depression, World War II. Reinhold Niebuhr had a more sophisticated view of what real power does to people. It corrupts people. And he was also at Union, though. So Union was this great place in New York, still is. November 7th, we took a little step back again before delving in, just to say the kind of church we are not only encourages, but in a sense requires its members to think for themselves. I mean, that's the free church tradition that we are in. It's a hallmark of mainline Protestantism that the truth is not just given to people. We do receive a tradition, but what we make of that tradition is really up to us. And this is good news, bad news. The bad news is you have to do your own thinking. The good news is you get to do your own thinking. I thought a good place to start was just going back to the roots here of Jesus himself, especially what's understood these days to be the most likely real life of Jesus of Nazareth. Before his disciples, after he was gone, began to elevate him to a divine figure. And by the 4th century, Jesus was equivalent to God fully. But going back to the man himself, this is what we know about Jesus in terms of his key teachings, not just teachings, but activities. If the Gospels are fairly accurate about what Jesus said and did. And I share with you my own idea. I've never read this anywhere else. I'm sure other people have their own ideas. How did Jesus go from a teacher who was executed on a cross to, within at least 20 years, being regarded as Lord? I mean, so my own thought is it probably happened a lot sooner than 20 years. It was more like 20 minutes or 20 days that Jesus began to be regarded as a martyr by his friends, who somehow, as Marcus Borg says, embodied the fullness of God, disclosed God in some kind of unique way. This is not to say Jesus is God, or that he thought he was God, or even his early disciples would have said Jesus is God. That's a later development. But I think Jesus was so highly regarded in his life by his friends that his presence was felt palpably after his crucifixion. And they said, this is worth continuing. Let's continue his teachings and his activities and his deeds in his name. And they began to see him in some unique way as a unique manifestation of God. And this happened probably pretty quickly, is just my opinion, that especially as they gathered for a common meal and for Sabbath worship. And the Sabbath worship always ended with a meal. They said, you know, he shared a meal with us. He shared a lot of meals with us. So as we break this bread, as we share the cup, let's remember him. Does this sound familiar? I think that's kind of how it happened. Yes, please, Lori.
Jeff, just quickly to add to your thoughts here, because I really like them, is the fact that they had to do all of this in fear and persecution. Immediately when your leader is crucified and the Roman army is against you, we know, well, we think we know that the disciples went into hiding, but to continue this in the face of persecution is maybe good for the religion because people have to be committed, but of course bad and frightening for those people who speak.
And if Jesus ever did ask for a commitment from them, as the Gospels seem to say, follow me, then they might have remembered what he said and said, well, it's now or never. This isn't something we can put on the back burner because we are being assailed and our country is under the oppressive boot of the Romans, and also in league with the leaders of our own religion, the temple elite in Jerusalem. If we don't act now, then when?
And
So,
voted to know that all except John were killed.
Mhm. They also died martyrs' deaths, many of them. Yes, thank you. We went back to Marcusburg on November 28th. Do you remember that little conversation he had with people in a room that was recorded about Jesus? I found this quote, not from that video, but just another quote. Jesus disclosed God's compassion, spoke of God in terms of compassion. Further down here, and Jesus himself, as a manifestation of the sacred, is often spoke of as embodying compassion. So even Marcus Borg, who makes this fine line division between pre-Easter Jesus and post-Easter Jesus, I think is bringing them together a bit here by saying that the pre-Easter Jesus can become for us even today kind of fullness of the disclosure of what God really wants for the world, which is a new world, a new heaven and a new earth, as Revelation says. So we went back to social gospel, spent a whole week on that, recognizing that the social gospel didn't just begin with Walter Rauschenbusch in New York City in the 1890s, but rather has roots in the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement. John Wesley was big on the concept of social holiness. Social holiness, that we're called to not only live lives of personal holiness, but social holiness. How we regard our neighbor is as important as how we live our own individual moral lives. We watched the film on Reinhold Niebuhr, December 14th. I thought this was a good quote of Niebuhr. Kind of sums up Niebuhr very nicely, if he can be summed up in one sentence. Most evil is done by good people who do not know that they are not good. It being Christmas time, December 21st, we looked at the mystery of the incarnation, the doctrine of the incarnation. And I'd like to take a moment here, reflecting on that and also our conversation on Trinity last week. It occurred to me after last Sunday that just as Marcus Borg has taught us to look at the narratives of the New Testament, not literally, but seriously, and that a narrative can be true without being factual. A narrative, a story, can be true, capital T, without being factual. He says, once you look at the whole Bible that way, as metaphor, it doesn't take away from Scripture's power. It allows Scripture to have the power it was intended to have. So to speak of God as a rock, for example, is a metaphor. God is not really a rock, but it suggests stability. It suggests something to cling to in the stormy seas of life. The Bible's full of these gorgeous metaphors, right? Likewise, I think we can think of doctrines this way. Our sort of Western Enlightenment scientific mind, rational mind, wants to look at a doctrine and say, that makes no sense. Consider Christmas. There's the miraculous star in the sky. The angels speak to Joseph, to Mary, to the shepherds. The wise men come following this. There's a lot of fantasy, myth in the story, right? Maybe that sounds harsh to some who may feel the need to believe the literalness of that story. And yet you can, and also just the crazy idea that God became human in this one child, uniquely. You can pick that apart in a lot of ways, or you can step back from it and say, oh, Christmas. That helps me remember that God is close to us. You don't have to believe all that other stuff. If Christmas is to have power in our lives today, it can be taken as kind of a short, a way of taking us from the details of Christmas to the most important truth of Christmas, which is God is near. God cares. God is enfleshed in all of us. So doctrines can be understood metaphorically. Is this helpful?
Oh, yes.
What about Trinity? Trinity, God is one and three, on the surface makes no sense. But it can also be, if we can unhook our rational minds from it just long enough to use our spiritual imaginations and ask, but what truth is in the doctrine? The truth is God is community. God is relational. God is overflowing with love for the world, generated within God's self. Would we today pick Trinity as the best metaphor for a relational God? Probably not. We might say God is like a president more than a king. I read an article on this once. King is, top down ruler, do as I say or I'll punish you. A president, especially as we understand the American presidency, I'm not speaking of any particular president here. The American presidency suggests a figure who presides, who is head of state, head of government, who has a lot of latitude around the military and foreign policy. President's Day, we don't have a Congress Day, we don't have a court day, maybe we should. God as president does not have omnipotent power though, right? And just like the president of the United States doesn't have omnipotent power, that power is held in check by a free people and by two other co-equal branches of government. Maybe today we would pick that metaphor for God.
The true Trinity.
A true Trinity, right? Yeah. So when you hear Trinity in hymns, in prayers, on Trinity Sunday, you can get stuck on the details, or you can step back and look at it and say, I remember. That's the God who is one and many. Just like we are one and many, called to community. And there are other possible examples of that. The second coming can be, here comes Jesus out from the sky, coming on his horse. Nice crown, Jesus.
Can't we say what is God rather than who is God?
Yes, yes. First and second coming. There are so many things about the second coming that mainline liberal progressive Christians, we don't talk about it, right? And yet it's part of our tradition. It's part of Christian tradition. So to the extent that should a preacher on the first Sunday of Advent, when the readings are all about the second coming, if a preacher wants to deal with it or a confirmation teacher wants to deal with it, you can unhook yourself from the details of it and look at the truth in the doctrine, which is God will bring, the future is in God's hands, and it's good. It's not doom, it is good. A new heaven, a new earth. And what Jesus is always calling us, our attention to when he talks about the future, the apocalypse, is be ready, be alert, be aware, be prepared, be busy, be active. That preaches. And yet it's in concert with the traditional doctrine of the second coming and the doctrine of God, who or what is God. If God doesn't work for you, because there's lots of baggage with that word, maybe think of God not as the thunderbolt throwing Zeus in the sky, but just that God is love. God doesn't work for you in prayers and sermons, substitute love, and you are biblically grounded. So sorry for that detour. On the 9th, liberation theology, you might remember we spent a day on that. January 16th, the Bible. The cross. Lent is coming 2 weeks from today, first Sunday of Lent. When you hear all that substitutionary atonement stuff in hymns, remember there are other options. The last couple of weeks have been thinking about Christianity as relationship rather than rules, and all the trappings of religion that so disturb people. We talked about prayer on the 30th. I love this quote by Mother Teresa. How does that strike you?
That's what I think it is.
That's good, and we changed. Yeah, that is the social gospel.
2 weeks ago today, grace and faith. And last week, Trinity. I found this meme here, and it really addresses a question that Paul had last week. Why is the term person used? Well, here's a meme that crosses it out and suggests another phrase.
Could that be three ways in which people understand God? So people have different learning styles. So I'm wondering if some people need spirit, some people need authority figure.
Right.
So
So if Trinity bothers you in its wooden sense, in the sense that you must believe this to be a Christian, then if that works for you, then when you hear reference to it in hymns and prayers and sermons, allow your spiritual imagination to take you there because it speaks to you. Here are things we did not get to. Now, over to you. I'm going to invite us to address these questions. Here are 3 questions I'd like you to consider. This is just for you. You can share when we have that opportunity in a moment. If you'd like, you don't have to. As a result of this series, how has your understanding of Christianity shifted? So in my thinking, this question 1 was more of a head question. Number 2, I'm going for more of a sense of the affective domain, the heart in a sense. Do you feel a little more or any more at home, or maybe less at home with Christianity after this series? And I'm bringing back that question I raised on the very first day. Is this old book, Christianity, for you still worth reading? And number 3, what questions still remain? What topics still remain for you to explore? I'd like to hear from as many people as possible. And so what would you like to share with the group from your 3 questions? By the way, I want to thank Chuck, because way back when, Chuck, you said on the last Sunday, we should say, how have things changed for us? So you can give Chuck the blame or credit for this exercise of self-reflection. It's obvious that's what we should do. So let's hear from you. Of everything you thought and wrote down, what do you think the group can most appreciate hearing?
your summary slides were just spectacular.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'd almost like to answer the question with them in hand, because there's so much thought that went into this. But the thing for me was the Mother Teresa quote.
Yeah,
Was-
absolutely.
was through prayer, God changes us so we can change things. And that's my takeaway and what I learned from this that I never really appreciated before. And in terms of future, I'm thinking, well, suppose someone asked you to write a 3rd testament. What would you do? That's my big question. Huh?
Provocative.
Yeah, yeah, wow.
Good.
Because there's 2,000 years of history that are not included in the Bible.
Yeah, lovely question. Let's go to somebody on the screen. What are your thoughts you'd like to share with the group?
Towards the end, I wrote, I like the comfortable that will comfort. I need to venture into the uncomfortable to see how it can challenge or support my faith.
Thank you, Betty. Somebody else on screen, since our eyes are on you?
I would agree with Chuck. I thought Mother Teresa's quote really says it all, because I've wondered about prayer. You can't change God, but God can change us. And then we can move on. The other thing is, I would like to talk about the afterlife, but I don't believe in it anymore. I think we're all part of a larger continuum of energy and love. And I'd like to think, I mean, when I was a little kid, I thought, well, my dog went to heaven and my grandparents went to heaven. I'm not sure I believe that anymore, so I'd like to know more about that. And I think reading the Bible makes a lot of sense, as long as we know that it's metaphor. I'm glad that you said that. I can't believe a lot of this stuff that is in it if it's said as fact. And then I also think if for the future, if people don't believe in the afterlife, I think a lot of people joined the Christian church because there was hope for the afterlife. I don't know how we respond to that. So that's enough.
Thanks, Junior. Somebody in the room? Carol?
I'll talk a little bit. I came to, reluctantly came to church. I had to come to church because I married my husband who was a PK. But I really had a lot of problems being a Christian. I had a lot of problems being at church. Because church did not speak to me. All I could see was rules. I could not see babies being sinners from birth. So that, all that stuff. And I think WCC really changed me a lot. It started with Paul Allen, started speaking to me, and that continues to do so. And particularly, I think this whole series makes me feel much more comfortable that I can really celebrate being a Christian today in ways I was never able to do before. And I think the one thing that really has moved me is the idea of God. I have trouble with the word God, but the idea of God is being love and relationship, and that being implanted in us from the beginning, God being within us. And that gives me a very powerful sense. I think it's so empowering for all of us to think that way. Rather than being damaged from the beginning, we are enriched from the beginning, and we can use that enrichment to enrich everyone else in our life. And that's what really empowers me today.
Thank you. Matthew Fox speaks of original blessing, not original sin. Wow. Just that's the title of his book, but that's all you need to know is the title.
This is Shelley.
Yeah, Shelley.
I think your recap just reminded me, I agree with the gentleman that spoke first. This has been absolutely an extraordinary course and journey, and I feel like I've had a mini divinity education as a result. So thank you, Jeffrey, for all that time. I think the course really helped me place into really a framework, all the different beliefs and education I had as a very young Congregationalist, and have really sort of gotten confused and jumbled about with all that we read and are exposed to. So this was just really an invaluable framework for me to analyze and put things back together again. It was also very nice to meet, albeit remotely, new people that I don't know in the church that we've recently transferred to. So thank you very much on many levels.
Well, I just have some general comments. I don't know how much my understanding of Christianity has really changed, but the courses have been really helpful and kind of validating a lot of ideas that I have had about religion. So in that sense, Christianity is in among all the other good religions. I'm still not convinced that religion is, I think it really serves a purpose, but I don't think you have to be a religious, a churchgoer, a religious person to be a good person. I do think that the divine lives in all of us. And to me, God has, I can't say always, but in my adult life, God has always been kind of the interrelational interconnections we've had between people, one-on-one and one-on groups. And I'm really simplistic, but to me, I think that this idea of original blessing, which I had just heard today, but that really makes sense to me, because I think that, I believe that I think all people really have a really good side to them, but life is hard and not everybody can respond to life with grace and faith like we've talked about. So the bad side of them comes out, and that's what we see. And to me, if there's an afterlife, to me, it's a party in the sky where only the good parts of us go. And so we can continue to interact with people and to love people. And I don't really believe that. That's kind of a metaphor of what I think about afterlife, because I do think that we have kind of a spirit that lives on, and animals have a spirit that lives on because it's in us. It's in us. So we keep the other people alive. I mean, the people who've passed away alive. That's what I think. And so this course has kind of validated a lot of those feelings. Maybe not in a traditional way, but to me, so Christianity to me feels like really most other religions.
I would, well, first of all, echo what Shelley said. It's been an extraordinary journey over the last 17 weeks, and you've done an extraordinary job. So thank you.
Amen. Yes, indeed.
In kind of summarizing my feeling after these 17 weeks, I would say it comes down to, I feel the church is more welcoming than I did before. And I think of Jesus saying, let the children come on to me. And we are the little children. And that makes me feel good.
Welcoming because you can ask these questions, or
That, just the idea of Jesus and God as love.
I see.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been quite a journey for me personally. I'm reminded of it in a personal way and how I've changed. And truly, I came in here really, I don't know what word I used and you questioned me, but cynical, I think is. I'm reminded now of what I've learned, and it has to do with you can, a person can go through hell and literally feel like they've gone through hell in a week's spat with something or whatever, and come out if they've expressed, in my case, if they've expressed it in these kind of terms that we've talked about, through perhaps the simple word love, but through understanding of what's gone on, through a compassion, that whatever you're reminded of that was so awful is now embraced in sort of this new philosophy, this thing they call God or something. I'm reminded of George Balanchine's ballet, The Prodigal Son. And he leaves home, of course, he jumps over the white picket fence and he's out there with a siren and she's got red bloody tights on and she walks across the stage like a spider or something. Now he cavorts through Act 1 and 2 and then he goes home to his father, who happens to be on the stage in Ravinia, and it's really George Balanchine. And he crawls up George Balanchine's body, and then Balanchine takes his cape and holds the prodigal son, and the curtain falls. And everybody's happy. And that's how personal this can be for somebody who's been through so much, but also to put it in the modern sense, through the world's agony. If there could be this unity, this understanding.
Well, as you all know, I was raised as a Unitarian. The Unitarian Church has been without any indoctrination in Christianity much. I could hear the story of Joseph. I finally worked out his little play, but I really appreciated these last 17 weeks as a review of Christianity. There's so many things I didn't really know much about. I really enjoyed the documentary on Reinhold Niebuhr, his thoughts and ideas, and on liberation theology. And I have a great appreciation for the history of all religions. But I come back to, really appreciate the way I was raised Because really, I know the Unitarians are not considered a Christian church with a capital C, but we do practice all the things that Christ talked about. And we are in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of making the world, righting some of the iniquities of life around the world, and the great gratitude and appreciation of all the beauty in everybody and around us in nature. And I'm very grateful to be alive and to be here.
I just want to thank you for all the work you put into this. This, I think, is really remarkable.
Amen.
And I
Thank you,
think-
Jeffrey.
Me too. I agree.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
It's been great.
I think we all appreciate,
Incredible.
like, speak for all of us, is the opportunity for us to just explore all of these different aspects among one another and for our individual person. And the church's philosophy to allow that, to promote that, I think is very, very valuable.
You're a free church, free church.
Yeah.